Great. Well, thank you very much. I'd like to, in particular, thank Svea Braunert, Birgit Meersman, and Jens Schroeter for organizing this series of conversations, which is really exciting as an interdisciplinary conversation on abstraction. So I'm happy to be part of it. So thank you for including me. Now, this is a lecture that I give in with different parts, and I rearrange it sometimes. And so I've sort of tailored it to some of the themes for the lecture series. And it's organized as a series of stories, fables almost, about queer abstraction, which is a way of introducing some of its key terms. So to begin, it's a common refrain to say that being visible is crucial to queer life and politics. To come out, to stand up, to be recognizable to others with whom one might form a community, these calls to action have come to be equated with pride and with progress. They express a desire for and a politics of representation. It's often assumed that only through representation and recognition can queer life flourish. Such a politics of visibility demands that queer people serve as representatives of queer life, and their visibility is the catalyst for change and for community. However, as any queer person knows well, being seen as queer comes with costs and dangers, as well as pleasures and connections. What of those moments and forms of queer life that refuse to be visible, that enjoy the evasion of detection, or that take a rest from being recognizable? Such positions of non-representation can also be political, transformative, pleasurable, life-saving, and defiant. Well, abstraction is a practice of non-representation. And I forgot to share my screen. I want to just put the slides on. I haven't started talking about anything visual yet. It's fine. Sorry about that. I just dove right into it. Okay. There we go. So as I was saying, abstraction is a practice of non-representation. It turns away from resemblance and the recognizable image. It offers constellations of form, including its component categories such as shape, material, line, color, process, and so on. And it prompts us to engage with formal relations directly, rather than see those elements as an image of something elsewhere or previously seen. Such relations, that is the intercourse of forms, are foregrounded in abstract art. The question of relations among genders, among lovers, among partners, among others, is also fundamental to queer lives and politics in all their varieties. Seeing potential in this analogy, some queer artists have left behind the imaging of bodies, instead turning to abstraction to imagine the many forms that queer life and relations might take. Now, abstraction has been employed by queer artists for a long time, and they are among those who adopted it as an avant-garde mode in the early years of modernism in the early 20th century. However, since the 1970s, an increasing number of contemporary artists have chosen abstraction as a means to more openly or more complexly address queer life, to address non-normativity, and to address other forms of desire, love, and connection. So this talk is going to focus on 3 brief case studies that help illuminate how abstraction can be viewed queerly, how it can be used to evoke community, and how it can be used to analogize intimacy. Now, my emphasis is going to be on the American context, and I'm going to focus on early formulations of this tendency there. I'm going to start in the early 1960s with the poet Frank O'Hara and his view of the abstract sculpture of the straight artists David Smith. I'm then going to shift to the ways in which feminist art of the 1970s, with its more direct engagement with the politics of the personal, was the context for some of the most important early versions of queer abstraction in American art. So I'm going to discuss here the feminist artists Lula Mae Blockton and Harmony Hammond, focusing on key works in which they arrived at queer abstraction in the 70s. And I should just remind us that both of those artists continue to make queer work today. So my aim here is not to provide a comprehensive statement of what is best understood as an expansive set of capacities. Instead, these three stories are going to open into these ideas in a different way. And from the webinar panels, can I just have a thumbs up if you can see the table of contents, the slides? Good. Okay, good. Making sure we're all set. Thank you. So each of these stories is about relations, from the personal to the social to the erotic. And also at the end of this lecture, I'm going to include a brief postscript where I discuss the historiography of the concept of queer abstraction in the context of American art. So all of this brief commentary will put into perspective the writing about this idea as it has grown, especially over the last 3 decades. Well, on to the first story. In the summer of 1961, Frank O'Hara traveled to visit the abstract expressionist sculptor David Smith at Bolton Landing, his studio in the country in upstate New York. O'Hara was then an assistant curator at the Museum of Modern Art's International Program, and he had been tasked with doing an exhibition on Smith. Sculpture was not familiar territory for O'Hara. Painting was O'Hara's preferred ground. He counted painters among his friends, and his work as a curator had been built on those relationships and his proximity to the newest developments in painting. Of course, O'Hara was also a major poet, and he would become one of the key American writers of the post-war era. He developed a staccato style that mixed the perception of the rapidity of the city with the anchors that memory lay on those images and moments of connection. One way that O'Hara's poetry has been described is as a counterpart to action painting and its emphasis on the seemingly spontaneous painterly gestures as expressions of deeper feelings. But what's most important for our purposes is to understand that in both his work as a poet and his work as a curator, it really was painting that was O'Hara's recurring touchstone. But then there was sculpture. O'Hara had written about sculpture a little bit, but it wasn't really until David Smith that he began to be excited about it in a different way. Smith's composite metal sculptures translated the abstract expressionist drip or gesture into welds that held pieces of scrap metal together in aerial, open, graphic constellations. Smith's use of welded metal allowed him to atomize the traditional verticality of the sculptural monolith or figure into an open architecture in which the spaces between the sculpture's parts played equal roles in expanding outward into surrounding spaces and landscapes. O'Hara had been assigned to curate a touring exhibition of Smith's work on very short notice, and it turned out to be a very good time to visit. Smith had custody that summer of his 2 daughters, to whom he was devoted. Concurrent with the summer of their visit, he had made great strides in a new group of sculptures in this happy environment. And he installed the new works out in the rolling hills of his upstate New York compound so that they perched on the slopes, alone or in groups, and were framed by the surrounding landscape. Smith and O'Hara were not well acquainted at this time, but they found an affinity that August weekend of O'Hara's visit. Smith was suspicious of curators and writers, and he often made statements against critics and their attempts to translate art into words. As well, Smith and O'Hara were different in other fundamental ways. O'Hara was nimble, wry, witty, often layering verbal allusions and meanings. His homosexuality was what they then called an open secret. Smith, on the other hand, was gruff and often moody, and he had a reputation for the kind of performative, heterosexual masculinity that was characteristic of the abstract expressionist movement. But that weekend, Smith responded well to the infectious enthusiasm that O'Hara discovered in Smith's sculptures. Days after returning to the city, O'Hara expressed this in a letter to Smith, saying, quote, "I've been thinking about the new work ever since leaving, and it's staggering," unquote. O'Hara tried to articulate these feelings he was having about the sculptures. He said, quote, "They get to me, but I don't get to them. They make me feel like the world going round and round and not knowing what's going on, or, in a word, alive," unquote. In this letter, he concluded with a postscript where he enthused, quote, "What I think I mean by the above is that I'd like to be one of those sculptures," unquote. Now, soon thereafter, O'Hara wrote a large article for Art News about Smith's new work, and the concluding lines of that article reiterated this strong declaration of identification. Quote, "The best of the current sculptures didn't make me feel I wanted to have one. They made me feel I wanted to be one," unquote. Well, now we must take seriously this repeated and published statement that O'Hara desired to be a Smith sculpture. In his poetry and in his art criticism, O'Hara had explored the idea of multiple selves, the different aspects that make us who we are and who we selectively offer to others. Such multiplicity was an aspiration for O'Hara, but it also spoke to the survival tactics of Cold War homophobia, in which homosexuality was seen as a pervasive suspicion about others. Being more than what one appeared, that is, having different angles of approach, was both thrilling and protective for O'Hara. His encounter with Smith's sculptures visualized this aspiration. The metal compositions alluded to persons, but were responsive and different from each successive viewpoint. They were all more than one thing, and O'Hara wanted to be just that. Now, what I'm briefly arguing here is that O'Hara found queer possibility in Smith's abstract sculptures. Now, many have often assumed that queer interest or engagement is piqued through the erotically appealing body. But O'Hara saw Smith's virtuosic multifacetedness as an analogy for queer complexity and personal multiplicity. Smith had pursued formal and semantic openness for his own reasons and from his own identity position. O'Hara saw Smith's sculptures differently, identifying with them for the ways in which they connected to his queer experience. Queer life involves the navigation of questions of disclosure, of visual scrutiny, of alterity to presumed norms, and of the pleasures and dangers of seeking out others who too feel differently. These queer experiences of being more than one thing and being more than what one appears are themselves hard experiences to visualize. O'Hara had been trying this in his poetry, and he found in Smith's sculptures and in a practice in which the mundane, discarded steel, was transformed into a choreography of aspects that were each distinct, yet nevertheless cohered. That coherence came not despite, but because the sculptures were different depending on how one approached him. It was what O'Hara, too, had been trying to do with poetry. He didn't need to be like Smith, however, to want to be like one of his sculptures. He viewed and wrote about abstraction queerly, seeing as related to a life experience of his own, that is queer experience, that he knew the artist did not share. Now, herein is the lesson for me, is the history of queer abstraction is sometimes a history of these kinds of readings and receptions in which others, the forms of others, afford an opportunity to see an allegory for queer life, as in O'Hara's queer identification with a straight sculptor's works. In other words, it's not just abstractions made by self-identified queer artists that matter in our story. Sometimes the particularity of one's queer life finds in an abstraction a form for living. With this in mind, we must remember that what might be queer for one person might not at all be for another. Now, a moral of this story, and each of my stories are going to have a little moral at the end. A moral of the story is that queer views of abstraction are sometimes found even if they were never planned or intended. Queer abstraction can be inadvertent, but this does not make it any less affecting or engaging. A task of queer art history is to locate capacities for identification, for disruption, for unforeclosed potential in the past, even if we are the first to find them there. Now, from this story, I'd like to jump to another. And again, I understand that these are quite brief, but I'm trying to give a sense of range. And I want to jump forward a decade to the 1970s. The previous story was one about a queer viewer finding identification with abstractions not made with queer intent. But now I'm turning to a lesbian artist who used formalism and formal abstraction to visualize new possibilities and a newfound community. In 1975, Lula Mae Blockton made her painting Summer Ease out of a feeling of happiness and potential in finding a community. This airy yet dense vernal painting of interwoven and plaited translucent bands came from a time of change in her life and her art, when she said, quote, "I learned how to translate personal responses to my environment via color," unquote. Well, Blockton had moved to New Jersey from the Midwest in 1972 because of a teaching job at Keene College, now Keene University. And it was there that she met her partner and later wife, Shirley Bernstein, who was teaching printmaking. Her relationship with Bernstein encouraged her to move to New York City in 1973, where she began to find connections with others like her. Blockton had joined with a group of artists to form the New Jersey-based collective Black Women in Visual Perspective. She also participated in the newly visible out post-Stonewall lesbian and gay culture, in what she described as, quote, "then the gayest city in the United States and the art capital of the world," unquote. Now, across and within these new New York City communities, Blockton found herself grounded in ways previously denied to her. Of these years, she recalled, quote, "there was a rebelliousness involved with that because I saw how women, lesbians, gays, LGBTQ+, how our community was just being completely not taken seriously at all. And so I had decided at one point that I was just going to try to be as true to myself as I could, be in my studio as much as I could, and try to make images as true to me as I could," unquote. Summer Ease, this painting that you can see in the background, marked that transition in Blockton's work. She was and continues to be a committed abstractionist, using precise color theory in her paintings to stage interactions and overlaps between hues. Previously, as with this painting, she had employed the modernist grid, and she painted fields of squares made from regularized bands of color in equal widths. But in 1975, she left the ordered geometry of the repeated square to one side. She explained, quote, "when I first came to New York, initially, I felt a grid, a structured environment. And as I stayed and became more comfortable, it became less so. I started to feel the geometry of the city, the architectural aspect of the city, and it was not primarily based on any kinds of squares. It was based upon changing the rectangular shapes," unquote. As the historian Barbara Stella remarked about this moment, Blockton loosened the weave that had determined her earlier abstract paintings. Now, she didn't actually abandon the weave as a structure. She only traded its rigidity for variation. Weaving is, as she said, quote, "about the actual physical threads being together," unquote. In comparison to her earlier works, Summer Ease, this transitional painting in which she loosened the weave, this painting exhibited a formal relaxation of those rules that had previously bound her precise experiments with form. Blockton credited this painting with a move to a more intuitive process of geometric abstraction, as well as the use of color. The palette at first seems to be unified by sunny pastels, even though it also contains intense purple, brown, green, chartreuse, and orange hues. Lockton aimed to create the appearance of transparency and translucency in this painting. And these effects are usually rendered in oil paint through the depiction of objects layered in space. But Blockton's abstractions in oil paint offer little to no pictorial space or recognizable objects or materials. Rather, she pushed her use of oil paint to depict the optical effect of transparency through the shallow pictorial field of the woven grid. Blockton explained, quote, the idea of transparency is that you're not able only to see the surface, but you see through it. And then colors become able to be worked with one another, one over another, under one another, and work as a whole image, unquote. The perpendicular thresholds, where the vertical and the horizontal bands connect, are where the optical effect of transparency becomes most apparent. At those moments of overlap, there is sometimes a sliver of opacity where the touch of the two colors compounds and redoubles. The bands find new possibilities in each lateral passage and climb through the open weave of the painting, and we are directed to those moments of contact between the bands. In short, Summer Ease transforms the irregular grid into a symphony of connections among the individual colored bands that activate each other as they contribute to the whole. And I should just pause to say that I'm employing a very formalist method, following the clues from Blockton in accounting for this painting, and really trying to animate the forms through this kind of deep description. And this is, again, trying to keep us attuned to how the painting is working. Now, Summer Ease is a painting about relations and the capacity for mutual inflection, and it alludes to the summer's warmth that brings people out to gather. However abstract, it attempts to capture the light, the heat, the ease of that summer of possibility, affection, and new attachments that Blockton experienced. Her painting drew from these newfound connections in the vibrancy and potential of her city, where she found, for the first time, love, community, and support. Of this moment, Blockton recalled, quote, we banded together and we did have a community, a wonderful community of people accepting each other, but we were all just struggling. We were all struggling just to stay in New York, survive, pay the rent, feed ourselves, and then try to change attitudes as much as we could, unquote. In the 1970s, people often came to the cities not just to find a place to escape, but to find support and others like them. Blockton's painting was an attempt to convey that queer life she had begun to find in New York City without representing it, without picturing it. Summer Ease is grounded in the queer experience of finding a possibility in community after isolation and misunderstanding. I see these interwoven bands, the idea, the metaphor of the weave, the ways in which the moments of connection seem to vibrate in these slivers of opacity, and the ways in which overall it creates an interlocking community of support as the ways in which Blockton translated some of these more inchoate feelings of community and ease into the formal dynamics of what is really a kind of hard edge abstraction. Now, the painting's manifesting of this intensity of connection is open-ended and generous. Any could be welcomed into this family. It's not just a depiction of coupling, but rather of a weave, of a community. The human form in these paintings is neither referenced nor even implied, to say nothing about presumptions of sex or gender. Yet these painted, plated bands evoke the actions of bearing others, of touching others, of being seen through others, and being enmeshed in something that is more the sum of its parts. So there's a lesson to Blockton's painting that I find. And this story reminds us that, quote, that even the most committed forms of abstraction can allude to or allegorize social relations through the playing out of formal relations. This can be accomplished without signaling, implying, or imagining a body. Relations, both formal and social, need not be prescriptive or proscriptive, but rather can also be open to new conjugations and new combinations. This with Blockton's painting, again, I signaled a highly kind of formal read of it, and also wanted to emphasize that the accounts of queer life that we're getting from both O'Hara's reading of Smith and of Blockton's painting are ones in which it's a wider range of queer experience, not focused solely on questions of desire, sexuality, coupling, or romance. So I've been trying to kind of model these larger ways in which queer life could be allegorized through abstraction. But we cannot forget about the erotic. So the third story deals with that. Harmony Hammond is a significant artist, and I'll talk about her as well in the historiography postscript. She curated the first significant exhibition of gay or lesbian art in the United States. And this was in 1978. She's an incredibly important figure, both as an artist and as an organizer. She was part of the editorial collective who published the Lesbian Art and Artist issue of the feminist journal Heresies in 1977. And this publication was arguably the first and forthright and politically aimed compendium of gay or lesbian art history. For this history-making publication, Hammond chose a single work of hers to be illustrated amongst the many other artists that she and the collective included. And this was her abstract assemblage Conch, made that same year. Now, Conch is composed of it through an act of doubling, with its paired oblong forms sitting one on top of the other. Hammond created each by wrapping an internal armature with knotted and bound fabric, which accumulated through layering and tying, thus creating bulk around the armature to the point where the walls of the central void of the form come to be pressed together. Over this fabric, Hammond placed layers of pigment, gesso, emulsions, and other translucent painting media to give it a unifying pinkish color and surface. Conch is one of a series of wrapped works made in the late 1970s, such as these, in which Hammond tested the limits of painting and sculpture, and more importantly, proposed these works as evoking the female-identified body, its eroticism, and its capacities. She considered the densely wound, bulky fabric to be like muscles surrounding the bone armature, and covered with a painted chromatic skin. And so these are the terms that she described, this wrapping process of creating around an armature these fulsome forms, comparing it to skin, flesh, and bone. Now, across her early works, there is this form that we see doubled in Conch, that of the horizontal form. Across Hammond's early works, she investigated horizontality as a crucial metaphor, and Conch's mirror doubling derived from this priority. She had, in 1973, created floor-bound braided fabric tondos before proceeding to investigate wall-bound works with horizontal forms. As she returned to working with the wall, the oblong horizontal form recurs throughout her paintings, assemblages, and sculptures of these years. And this exploration of horizontality can be taken both as a challenge to verticality, which is often coded as phallic, as well as implying a horizon or a lateral endlessness. And these gendered terms around thinking about something like verticality or horizontality are very much part of the discourse of feminist art in the 1970s. Indeed, works such as Conch and Durango that I show here are in spirited dialogue with the so-called central core imagery of feminist art in these years. Central core imagery is the term used to describe when vaginal forms are depicted or implied by a work. Coined and promoted by the heterosexual feminist artists Miriam Shapiro and Judy Chicago, central core imagery became a prominent and much debated format for feminist art in the 1970s. Central core imagery, from the abstract to the representational, tended to be vertical in its orientation to the floor or the horizon line, and it equated the sexed body with an essentializing account of gender, positing this one-to-one equation as a source of female power and aesthetics. Hammond, by contrast, adapted that imagery by emphasizing the span of the horizontal as, again, another attempt to provide an alternative to verticality's phallic implications and the central core imagery's paradoxical echoing of them. Well, this is an aesthetic and political debate in which Hammond's open, oblong, formal vocabulary emerged from. She also pushed her material process further to signal how this might open up into an eroticism within and among these wrapped forms. It is in this way that she attempted to declare a specifically lesbian retort to both phallic verticality and its counterpart offered by heterosexual feminist imagery. But to understand the importance of this horizontal gap in these wrapped works, I'm going to shift focus from Conch to illustrate a wall sculpture that I just have better and more detailed photographs of. And here I'm showing the larger and slightly later Durango, to which a life-size chair sculpture by Scott Burton can be seen for scale. Now, speaking of this work, Durango, Hammond remarked that it, quote, was a place where my lover and I met and touched. It is about a female sensuous presence, presence as essence made visible, a sense of touch, unquote. As the art historian Margot Hobbs has shown in multiple excellent articles on Hammond and lesbian art, the wrapping form was explicitly erotic for Hammond, who polemically used it to express lesbian experience and potential. The reclining central cores of Hammond's Durango and Conch have been worked, after all, with their boundaries repeatedly touched and wrapped in the process of laying down the fibrous textile layers. These sculptures are the results of hands working in and through those central forms. They showcase the way these surfaces have been touched and pulled and tied. They also bear the evidence of the movement of hands and fingers in and through the void at the center of the armature. This material and processual focus encourages a reading of these works as records of being touched, of being filled, and of being circled by Hammond's hands. There is an erotic implication of this process once we see the abstract form, the squeezing inward, thickening, round, horizontal band, seeing it as the result of the layering and squeezing of hands and fabrics into and out of its core. As one of the earliest versions of one of these wrapped wall works, Conch foregrounds the lesbian potential of this eroticized way of making. It comprises two substitutable forms that touch, one laying on top of the other. These two wrapped ellipses demand attention to their own labor-intensive process of coming into being through Hammond's durational acts of handwork. They are bulky and fulsome, with the resulting horizontally mirrored forms pressing against each other and into themselves in a cascade of contact that makes interior and exterior seem like irrelevant descriptors of this embrace. In this first, most polemical version of the wrapped horizontal in her practice, Hammond used the double to represent queer potential. Remember, this was the work she chose as her single illustration for the Lesbian Art and Artists issue of Heresies. And this work makes that reading of it as lesbian manifest through these two sensuous forms, both highly suggestive when understood in the context of the aesthetic and political debates about women's central core imagery in the 1970s. This work wears its process on its sleeve, and it tells the story of these two forms coming into being through Hammond's repeated manual attention to the continuities between their mirrored inside and outsides. In other wrapped works, Hammond would also use this tactile contact between doubled forms to imply a potential intimacy, eroticism, or love. For instance, Hug, this work, features two ladder-like forms propped up against each other. The latter is a vertical form, but it is one that's defined through its internal spaces. The ladder's functionality only occurs by breaking open the vertical with these helpful and supportive gaps. That is, a ladder only works because you can interweave with it, and its spaces hold and care for the one who presses their body against it as a means to go higher. I understand Hammond's use of the ladder form as an answer to the question of finding a compromise between anthropomorphic verticality and the problem of central core imagery. With its structuring voids, the latter is a non-phallic vertical. And this sculpture smartly offers a retort to the statuary tradition's emphasis on the monolithic form of the statue. Ladders, after all, are meant to be hugged closely. Or just to give another example of one of these wrapping works, and the idea of the touching double, Hammond would use these same worked, gapped, yet fulsome forms in pairs to imply not exact sameness, but suitability and likeness and contact. Again, the double is made intimate through its touching adjacency. Now, Hammond has been the most articulate and long-running proponent of queer abstraction in the US context, and I emphasize this early moment in the formative years of American feminist art, rather than her many important paintings, which she continues to make today, including being featured in the last Whitney Biennial. In the 1970s, some feminist artists, such as Hammond, turned to abstract art as a way out of the contradictions of figuration, with the long history of the objectification of the female form and its histories. They left behind the traditions of the figure, and these abstract artists instead created a zone in which bodily entanglements and empathies could be wrought through form and materiality. For Hammond, the challenge was to think about a specifically lesbian erotics of sameness and how it could be rendered in material and formal terms, thinking about sex and love and support, but without encouraging the kind of lurid objectification that often harried the representation of the female identified form and specifically harried lesbian representation. For Hammond, abstraction was a defensive position, to be sure, but it also opened out onto a larger account of how intimacy and relations could be envisioned through form and material. The moral of this story is that abstraction's turn away from representation can lead to a heightened engagement with material, process, and form, all of which may be used to evoke bodily or erotic analogies. In this way, it can offer an alternative to the contradiction of the figure's dual function as both an image of a subject and a target of objectification. Well, in these three stories, I have aimed for some deeper reads of individual works of queer abstraction rather than attempting a broad survey. And I wanted to give some of these kind of earlier moments as a sense of some of the kind of key issues that characterize the use of abstraction by queer artists or queer critics. Now, there are many more versions of queer abstraction and far too many to account for in one talk. But as I mentioned at the outset, over the past 20 to 30 years, there's been a surge of interest by queer artists in employing and theorizing abstraction, as well as by queer art historians writing about it as a larger tendency. For this reason, a few concluding words about the art historiography of those more recent developments in the United States are necessary. What I'm going to give you very briefly is not at all comprehensive. It's also very brief, and I certainly did not include everything. Nevertheless, I think it's important to give a snapshot of the the treatment of queer abstraction as a concept and how it's emerged historically. Again, my listing of the sources will be necessary, partial, and I'm aiming to identify broad trends. The slides I'm going to show have a lot of bibliography on them, so you may want to screenshot them and come back to them later. And for the students, we will circulate a list after. But it's not important to actually talk about each of the sources I'm mentioning. I'm trying to give you a sense of the overall trends. Now, so really, I'm going to be charting queer abstraction as a tendency, and I hope you'll forgive any omissions from this very brief overview. So the discourse of queer abstraction in the United States was initially forged through the writing of artists about their own practice. And I think in particular, the influence of Hammond has been profound. Since some of her first calls to queer abstraction in the 1970s to today, she's offered perhaps the most influential articulation of why abstraction matters to queer life and how its aesthetics can be political. Subsequently, artists such as Barbara Hammer also wrote important and influential texts about this. But in the early 2000s, in particular, there was a surge in other artists trying to formulate queer potential in abstract art. So Linda Bessemer, Ulrike Müller, Amy Silman, Gordon Hall, and Renate Lorenz have also written very influential texts that in turn have encouraged others to explore abstraction as a means to thematize sexuality and gender. And here I just show a few of those. As well, I think a really crucial text that inspired a lot of people to think, to return to abstraction, including myself, was Jack Halberstam's book, In a Queer Time and Place, which was a catalyst for many artists and scholars on the topic. While there had definitely been earlier art historical writing about queer artists who worked with abstraction or degrees of abstraction, such as substantial analyses of artists such as Jasper Johns or Felix Gonzalez Torres, it wasn't really until the early 2010s that there was a broader move among art historians to think of queer abstraction as a tendency or as a set of theoretical issues. And it was at this time in the early 2010s that they began to come up with a way to theorize queer abstraction as having a history, as having methods, and having a mode of practice. And here I list some of the work that was coming out at the end of the first decade of the 21st century. And of course, I have to include myself in some of these, so I'm sorry that my name appears on the bibliography, but it's there. But you really see that this starts to emerge from people working on very different topics, but all around the same time. And many of these art historians are also heavily influenced by their conversations with artists who had been writing in those years prior. So I think these things are working together. I would also just say that a very important exhibition was staged in Vienna in 2012. And subsequently, an anthology came out of that, Pink Labor on Golden Streets, that was, from my view, and I would like, if I'm wrong, someone please correct me, that this was the first really major attempt to synthesize the idea of queer abstraction. And that book in particular became influential in the United States. Well, just to move on pretty quickly, in the mid-2010s, the museums, well, first of all, the galleries and independent art spaces, and then museums began to catch up. And there was a series of exhibitions that attempted to synthesize this. Many of them started in smaller galleries or nonprofit spaces or smaller museums, and it building up and influencing larger major exhibitions at the end of the 2010s. And in particular, there was a strong vein of queer abstraction in Trigger, Gender as a Tool and as a Weapon at the New Museum, and the first major museum survey of queer abstraction was at the Des Moines Arts Center in 2019. Now, after that time, there's been a number of solo museum exhibitions. So this is the next thing that happens after these group formulations. There's a reinvestment in many of the key artists around queer abstraction. And in particular, these major solo exhibitions have tended to focus on artists for whom feminism, activism, and activism have been priorities. And so it's the lineage that's established by figures such as Hammond, Barbara Hammer, Jack Halberstam, that then became enabling for a new discourse around these solo exhibitions for artists such as Hammond herself, Louise Fishman, Linda Bessemer, Carrie Moyer, Sheila Pepe, and the Fierce Pussy Collective, and its members such as Carrie Yamaoka, who's just had a new book coming out. Now, it's really these solo museum exhibitions that establish a kind of canon for queer abstraction. And but this canon has hewn closely to feminist artists and that understanding of these tendencies. There is the one book-length study of queer abstraction, which I'm going to mention in a moment, largely follows this canon. But since those exhibitions within art, artist writings and art critical writings, there's been a rapid proliferation of texts. First, on the side of studio practice and criticism, with artists and art historians writing really about ideas and for makers. And I think I would include my 10 queer theses on abstraction with this, but other incredibly lucid texts such as Jill Cassade's Queer Expressivity. Now, this is on the art critical side. On the art historical side, there's also been a rapid proliferation in the last 5 to 8 years of robust art historical accounts of queer abstraction. As with many of those solo museum exhibitions, many have also repeatedly emphasized a relationship or dialogue with feminism. And so the one book-length study, which just emerged 3 years ago, Lancaster's Dragging Away, really takes that version of queer abstraction as its core. And so this is helpful for us to think about when we think about these trends, the ways in which artists have generated new ideas, because as a way of thinking of all of the future writing that's possible around topics in relationship to queer abstraction, and to recognize that this idea has been formulated both through artistic practice and art historical scholarship synergistically. Now, this is, again, a very abbreviated account of the last couple decades and the evolution of this concept. But I think it's useful in identifying key trends in the scholarship and the ways that certain artists have become organizing for the thinking of for many art historians, art critics, and other artists on the concept. With such foundations established, again, there remains a lot to be written, especially about the larger and longer histories of queer abstraction, not just in the United States, but in other places. And that's beginning to happen in different ways. There are many artists, including as well today, who continue to invoke the idea of queer abstraction. And it really remains to be seen how both queer and abstract will transform through their work. Well, from just this schematic introduction to queer abstraction as a mode of viewing, as an artistic priority, or as an art historical object of study, it should be clear that there's no one quick way to recognize a queer abstraction or to account for it. One needs to think with the artists themselves about the meanings invested in practice, the commitment to form, and the long-running development of visual vocabularies and conversations among artists. What I've tried to do today is show some relatively early moments as a way of thinking about how either critics or artists sort of arrived at a queer account of their abstract priorities. This involves a healthy dose of reading in and of working with artist statements for works that do not seem to visually unfold immediately into previously recognized queer themes or narratives. That's the point. It's not always easy to detect or to decide upon queer abstraction, but that is indeed its strength. Some might see this as obstacles, preferring the clearly visible or the immediately apparent. But by contrast, I think we should value such slow reveals. And I stress that we must get to know the art and in order to see these queer capacities emerge from it. And that's what I tried to do with the Blockton and the Hammond in particular, was linger over the work and really try and create that intimacy through formalistic methods. Now, this is important, that intimacy, that getting to know is important because after all, we don't really know another person when we first see them, nor can we immediately be assured of things such as their gender or sexuality. Why should we assume that of an artwork? When we linger with a work and get to know its desires, its needs, its priorities, we can see differently how it might speak to our own experience or even show us a pathway to visualize differently. Queer abstraction often requires this kind of commitment, this kind of faith, and it spurns transparency and a politics of visibility in favor of relationships in which complexity and particularity are disclosed slowly and deliberately. If anything, we should trust that abstraction has these capacities. It's productive and proliferative, and rather than an avoidance of representation, abstraction must be considered as an embrace of potentiality, of finding, and of positing the unforeclosed. Relations are meaningful, ethical, and political, and it is in the intercourse of forms that abstract art proposes new versions of relations. And with that, I'll close, and I'm happy to open up to questions. So thank you very much.